folks. I'm Katie.
I'm Vinny, and this is Learn Real Good.
This is a podcast that is a science podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously.
Neither do we.
No, perhaps not often enough.
We're both scientists and comedians, and we're here to have a good time and learn a little bit.
Yeah, not a long time. We're here for a good time, not a long time.
Is something happening? No. Something? What do you
It's
know?
a song. So how this podcast works, for those of you who are new, me and Vinny chit chat at the top of the show. We come with a fact, a fun science fact that we'll dish to each other.
Ooh, we dish it.
The hot goss in science. and I listen to too many reality TV podcasts, clearly. And then we will get to our special guest and have a lovely interview with them.
Perfect.
Cannot wait.
Well, now the question is, who's going to share their fun fact first?
Oh my gosh, you're ready to dive in. I have a whole bit.
I think I got one.
I have a whole bit. You're getting too fast into the facts.
Yeah.
Versus the chit
You
chat.
have a bit before the chit
Yes,
chat?
I've been working allergies.
Okay. Tell me your allergy bit. I want to hear it.
I have them. Anyway, no, I have allergies, but I don't know what I'm allergic to. So
You do?
I don't.
Oh, you don't?
Okay, and it's you know me. I'm like a dog with a sock, as my mother would say. When there's something that's bothering me,
Yes.
I'm obsessed with it. Like the ant problem we have outside our house right now. I'm obsessed.
Yeah.
So when I first had allergies, I got like all the tests, all the scratch tests. They were injecting me with all sorts of things of the common allergens. Nothing.
Okay.
So it's this mystery that's haunted me for years.
To this day.
Yes, and I've been trying to get a wrap on things because it seems to be seasonal, all right?
Okay.
That's my evidence.
All right.
Like spring and fall. And I've been watching on the weather app. It says like when the pollen levels are for different
Yes,
things.
the pollen forecast.
There's no rhyme or reason. My allergies are crazy right now and everything is low. I got nothing. Anyway, yeah, so science facts.
Yeah.
Vinny, go for it.
Oh, okay. So you know the smell after a rain.
Petrichor.
Petrichor, yes.
Yeah.
A lot of people's their favorite word, and it's a very common smell that people identify.
Yeah.
And a fun name. Well, it comes from the streptomyces spores. Now these
What?
are spores that live in the ground, and they don't move, and they just sit in the ground. Now here's the thing. How do they get in the air to make the smell of these? And they create a chemical called geosmin.
Then why don't we call it geosmin? Where does petrichor come from? I've got questions.
The petrichor is just the name of the smell. It's just like someone made up a poetic name for the smell. But it has a chemical compound, which is geosmin, and that smell is in there. And that's what you actually smell after a rain. But they recently found out that this comes from a bacteria that lives in the ground. And they're mystified because these bacteria don't move. And they want to know, how do they get these bacteria in the air for us to smell it to create these chemicals? Well, they've recently discovered that these bacteria, when it rains, they piggyback onto other microbes
What?
that do move. And then whenever it rains, these microbes climb up the plants and go up into the air. And these streptomyces, they they latch onto these microbes that do move, climb up into and then they get spread after the rain because of the disruption by the microbes.
That is a wild
move.
ride. Now, do we have any idea why they do this?
Well, that's how they reproduce. They can't reproduce underground. They have to spread their spores in the air locally. And so they piggyback on the rain-induced mechanism that makes these microbes move. So it's fascinating. So they live underground, they wait for it to rain, they hitch a ride, climb up the plant, and then spread their spores into the air. And what's fascinating is that humans are especially sensitive to geosmin. We have very sensitive detection. So a shark in the blood can detect one part per million of blood, whereas a human can detect geosmin as low as 400 parts per trillion.
You came with numbers today.
With numbers, yeah.
And we don't know why. That's interesting.
Well, they suspect that we need to be able to smell this for it helps with fertile ground, with plants and living, if it's a fertile ground, these bacteria live in there, and so we're attracted to it.
That's a journey.
Yeah.
I love that. That might be my favorite fact that you've brought.
Thank you.
Also appreciate the biology content.
Thank you.
You know, I love that.
I know.
Wow. I'm like blown away. I wonder why we call it petrichor, not just smummer.
Some bozo made up that word.
Easy.
Some nose clown.
Bozo the nose clown.
Yeah.
I don't know that clown. Okay, great. Well, I have a fact.
I love it. I can't wait.
My fact?
Yeah.
Are you ready? Are you ready for this?
Yes.
Protists. What up? How do you feel about protists? Do you know anything about when I say protist, you say?
Protest.
Protists, what are they? Do you have any ideas?
They're like small things. They're very early form of life?
Yeah. Well, I mean, sure.
Or are they that weird category that don't fit with like archaea and all that stuff?
Okay, kind of all of the above. So protists do belong to the overall grouping that we belong to called eukaryotes.
Okay.
So we're defined by having a certain cell type. That is, we have nuclei in our cells.
I don't let that define me.
You're not defined by your nuclei containing your nucleated cells?
No.
You're like, fair enough. Okay. I mean, I didn't make the categories. All right.
Sure.
So other things that belong to that category. So anyone with a nucleus. So us, fungi, plants, all animals,
yes.
right? So we're all under that umbrella. And so who isn't a eukaryote, who doesn't have a nucleus? Things like bacteria and those weirdos called archaea, which are very bacteria-like. So protists also belong to eukarya.
Okay,
They're sort of the catch-all group that doesn't, for the things that don't fit into every other category. They got a nucleus, so they belong in this group, but they don't follow all the requirements for what we've said you need to have to be a fungus, a plant, or an animal. So it's not a great group.
Right.
Because it has a lot of diverse organisms, and evolutionarily, they're very distantly related in some cases compared to the other groupings.
Sure.
Anyway, protists. So they are old, right? They were the first, they're thought to be the first eukaryotes. Now, a lot of these protists have taken into their bodies single-celled bacteria as sort of their energy servants.
That sounds familiar.
Did your cells, the cells you don't define yourself as, did that?
I have mitochondria. I'm not ashamed of it.
Well, I wasn't going to get into that, but yeah, so how the first protist came about was it was probably a bacteria or an archaean cell that took in an energy producing bacteria, which became an organelle called a mitochondria, and the same for chloroplasts, which eukaryotes that photosynthesize contain as well.
Right.
Anyway, that's not this story. So these are this is a current existing thing. I'm not talking about chloroplasts. I'm talking about actual bacteria. So protists will take in like single-celled little bacteria that can photosynthesize, and then they gain this ability of not only can they go around and eat food themselves like a little predator, but they also have a little energy pack that can use the sun to make their own food and oxygen, right?
It's like plugging in a solar panel to your phone.
Yes, exactly. Now, that happens a lot. There's a lot of protists that have done this.
Nice work, protists.
Now, less frequent, they can take in purple sulfur bacteria. So these are...
Purple especially.
They're purple in color. That's how they get their name.
Right.
Real creative. And they can make their own energy as well, but they do it in an oxygen-free environment.
Anaerobic.
They're anaerobic, yes. Okay, so some protists have taken these up, but that's very rare, or it hasn't been found a lot. It's much more common for them to pick up photosynthesizing bacteria. Okay, where do we get to the facts? So this is a new discovery. Well, there are signs that someone actually discovered this 100 years ago in one paper, and then no one ever followed up on it, and then these people rediscovered it.
Okay.
And that is a protist that has both
purple and and chloroplast?
Yes. And so they have like this triple forms of metabolism. They can eat their own food. They can use the sun's energy to make food, and they can they can reduce other things to make, not thermally, but they can reduce other things in order to make energy, even if they were in a low oxygen environment.
Wow.
Yeah.
Double redundancy.
Yeah. So super, super diverse. And that's
where did they find them?
The muddy bogs of southern Germany. I'm glad I had that pulled up.
Nice.
Yeah. So they live in typically oxygen poor environments. And so it makes sense to have that.
Well, they're going to do great after ocean acidification.
Well, they're not in the oceans.
Well, we better put them in there.
Yeah. Okay, well, they got some work to do. These guys already have issues with osmosis. They're constantly like pumping out water because they take it on because they're high solute. So maybe they would do well in a higher solute environment like the ocean. Maybe you're onto something.
Maybe I'm onto something.
Here's our plan.
All right.
We're going to kidnap these protists.
Yeah. Kidnap them?
Okay, let's rephrase that. We're going to invite them.
Yeah.
We're going to invite them cordially. Here's what we do. Okay,
right,
I've discovered it. We go to the muddy bogs of southern Germany.
As we were planning to originally.
I love a muddy bog vacation. We're going to dig a trench to the ocean.
Yes, as we often do.
And then it's up to them. If they want to go,
if they want to go, it's on them.
They can take a ride, make some petrichor.
Yeah. Wait, no. Maybe they do.
I'm trying to connect things.
It worked. You're trying to connect the southern bogs of Germany to the ocean.
That has been my big plan for years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty cool. A triple threat.
Yeah. That's pretty
cool. Like the EGOT of energy systems.
Now I wish that was the heading. Yeah. That would have caught my eye for sure. I love an EGOT winner. Whoopi Goldberg.
EGOT winner.
Yeah. Who else is an EGOT winner? Oh, darn.
There's a few.
I know. There's not many.
No,
John Legend?
I think John Legend.
He might have done that.
I think he might have recently.
And Lin-Manuel Miranda will any day now.
Any day now. Like, it's just counting down the hours.
I think he's an Emmy away. All right, that's enough tomfoolery. Now, the main part of this show is an interview with an all-star guest.
Yes.
Going to talk about their research.
Yeah, today we have a Canadian grad student. Let's say hi to Cierra Stiegelmar. She's a medical student at the University of Calgary. She obtained her undergraduate degree in neuroscience at the University of Alberta in 2020 and began a master's degree at the same university, studying how individuals with amputation can develop a sense of control over myoelectric prostheses. She hopes to continue applying her neuroscience background to the rehabilitation field to improve the quality of life of those who undergo amputation. Along with clinical research, Cierra enjoys reading, listening to music, and experimenting with new hobbies she discovered during COVID, such as furniture restoration.
Wow.
Furniture restoration.
Very cool.
Hi, Cierra.
Hi, guys.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us on Learn Real Good.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And congrats. So the med school is big news for Cierra.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, it happened very quickly, but yeah, I'm looking forward to starting. Yeah.
Nice.
Amazing.
Yeah, they heard your 3-minute thesis and they were like, we need her now.
Yeah.
Speed her through. She doesn't need any of those credits.
No, I think they might have heard that she was going to be on this podcast. And they're like, we got to snap her up before she gets on the podcast.
Yes, our podcast is famous for making people so famous that they
don't
quit.
need to be med students anymore.
Yeah, that's probably what happened.
Yeah, that's probably what happened. That's generous of you. The myo part, that's
myoelectric prosthesis.
Myoelectric. That screams to me muscles. Am I correct in that? Myo?
Yeah, exactly. So a myoelectric prosthesis, it uses the electrical activity within the muscle to direct the movements of the prosthesis. So yeah, they're pretty cool. They're quite advanced, but surprisingly, they're quite hard to operate as well. So that's kind of where my work comes into here.
Very cool. Now, before we get into the prostheses, I would love if you could talk a bit about electricity in muscles. What's up with that?
What's the deal with that?
Yeah, so when you move your limb, a lot of the times the muscles, they generate some sort of electrical activity. And so that's just how they contract when you want to move your limb normally. So when we think about applying that to a prosthesis, a lot of the times after somebody gets an amputation, the muscle is still there. So it can still move and operate, but just not in the same way that we're used to. So it can still activate. And when we develop a prosthesis for somebody to wear, you can use that activity that's already there to then be used as control signals to drive the movement of the limb.
Amazing.
Very cool.
Yeah, and I guess we'll talk a little bit about the kind of work that you're doing with these prostheses.
Yeah, so it's I kind of hinted at it a little bit, but these devices, a lot of them they're really, really advanced, and so they're essentially like wearing a computer. So you know how you can operate a smartphone on a daily basis. these devices are really, really advanced, but they're also kind of tricky to operate. So I've kind of tried it a little bit in the lab. They have something called a simulated prosthesis. And so that's something where you put like, it's called a myoband. You kind of put something on your arm and that will detect your muscle activity. And then that will be used to drive a robotic limb that's kind of, it's not attached to you, but it's kind of on the table there. And it can be very frustrating because you need to isolate which muscles you're activating and make sure you relax completely between each movement. And that's not really natural for us. We tend to, it seems so intuitive for us to operate our normal limbs. But when somebody uses a prosthesis for daily activities, it can be very, very frustrating for them to develop a sense of control over that. So what I do is study sense of agency, which essentially means a feeling of control over that limb. So different ways, how can we study it? How can we measure it? And how, when we have a better understanding of sense of agency, how we can use that to develop better training protocols or even better design for how these devices can operate in the future.
So what are the factors that give someone a sense of agency?
That's a very good question. So there's a few things that can lead to a higher sense of agency. When we have more sensory information that is provided to us, then that sense of agency increases. So when we move in a daily basis, we can watch our arms move. We get like the proprioceptive feedback within our arms. We can hear things happening. And then obviously touch is a really, really important factor. And so this is why we don't always need to be watching our arms when we're moving. So you can reach for a glass of water and you know you're not going to knock it over. So having more and more feedback does give people a higher sense of agency. And then there's also something that's related to the expectancy. So they describe it as contiguity. So when you want to act and then an action happens or an event happens and it's expected, that can give you a higher sense of agency. And this is kind of going down into the rabbit hole a little bit, but there are certain factors that increase that contiguity aspect. And then that contiguity aspect increases sense of agency. So it's kind of like this stepwise factor where you start with like the minor things and they gradually build into a better, more holistic sense of agency and then sense of self, sense of embodiment. So it's definitely a very complex web of sensations that we experience on a daily basis and we don't know that we're experiencing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Cierra, how are myoelectric prostheses? I have a hard time with that word. Prostheses.
Prostheses.
I always want to just describe a singular prosthesis. How are they an improvement from previous sort of modes of prosthetics, or are they sort of a lateral move to other forms of prosthetics? What makes them good?
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit of both. So previous devices, like you can look back in history and people were making prostheses back, I don't know when the first time was, but even back in the medieval era where they would kind of design something to replace the function of a lost limb or something like that. So these are more cosmetic prostheses. And so those are the ones that they're not really meant to do anything. They're just meant to look like a normal limb, or sometimes people want them to look different, and it's totally okay too. But they're just there for appearance. And then you have something called, I'm forgetting what it's called, but it's operated using cables. So with that, it's you use your shoulder movement of like the opposite shoulder as the amputation. And this, I'm talking about upper limb prostheses here. And you kind of shift that shoulder to move the elbow of that prosthesis. And then sometimes you have additional movements that will be meant to close and open the hand. So those were a step up from the cosmetic prostheses. And then myoelectric prostheses are a little bit more advanced. But ironically, some people do tend to lean more towards the previous models because they do feel a higher sense of agency over them. So it doesn't sound like it makes sense, but a lot of people, they get more feedback from their body from moving that. And because the movements are simpler, they're a little bit more expected. There's less training that's needed to operate them. So that's why sometimes people, the myoelectric prostheses are obviously more advanced, but in a way they can be a little bit more tricky to operate.
And do you specialize in like upper body limbs, or is this also for any prosthetic?
Yeah, so I focus more on the upper limb prostheses, but the lab I work with, they do some work with lower limbs as well. So that's kind of it's a big lab in the sense that it does collaborate and do work in a lot of different areas. But for me, I focus on the upper limbs.
So how does a myoelectric prosthetic work?
They detect that electrical activity, and then they translate that into a movement. When you get an amputation, or when people get an amputation, sometimes the physician will move some of the muscles around within that residual limb. So that muscle activity will drive the prosthesis to open and close. But what the doctor can do is move the muscles in a way and create and put the sensors in the socket of that prosthesis in certain locations. So it feels a little bit more intuitive when people are closing and opening their hands. So when they think, I want to close my hand, they actually feel like they're closing their hand, and then the prosthesis will close. So you can have them operating that way. And then you can also have different complexity levels too. So a lot of them will just use a 2-site operating system where you have one sensor on one side and one sensor on the other side, and it's just close and open respectively. But then you can have a little bit more complex systems where you have more than those sites, and then you have the option to do pattern recognition. But sometimes you can have it where the pattern of the different muscles that are activated will control how the prosthesis operates. And so a different pattern will lead to different actions for the device. And then you can have it where one muscle activating will switch the function to a different grasp or something like that.
With these types of prostheses,
nice,
nailed it. What would you say is the hardest or a very difficult movement? Like, is there a certain thing that's really hard to nail? Like the last thing that someone checks off the list when they're training? Like, are there certain types of movements that are really challenging with them?
Yeah, so we do have some tests that we do in the lab that kind of target these more difficult movements. And while I'm not sure if there's one that is the most difficult, there are certain activities that tend to be a little bit more difficult. And these are the ones that require the activity of multiple groups of muscles to function, that we think is very easy. So for example, one of them is called the pasta box task. And so it's essentially, they have a craft dinner box, and what you're supposed to do is just pick it up and you move it to different locations within this setup that they have. And it's kind of meant to resemble how you would be operating in a kitchen. So you pick something up and you put it kind of up on one side, or you pick it up and then you put it down and you turn the other way. And it's difficult for people who are using a prosthesis, especially the higher the amputation level is, the more complex the prosthesis and the more difficult these movements are. So say, for example, somebody who has one where they want to lock the elbow. And so what that means is that they pick a location or a specific position that the elbow is in, and it kind of stays there. And so if you can imagine like trying to move and pivot, they tend to compensate with the rest of their body. So instead of just reaching with their arm, they're pivoting and they're kind of lifting their shoulder to get it in certain locations. Right. So those are those are more complicated movements, essentially.
I really hope that Craft Canada's listening and they're going to give us sponsorship so you can change this from the pasta box test to the KD test. I feel like that's very Canadian. You know,
I mean, I sometimes fail that push tab to open test on the pasta box. I find it quite challenging.
Well, we all know that's impossible. Prosthesis or no.
No,
that's
I know.
just something that can't be done.
It can't be done.
No,
I
science
prefer
can't.
to just hack at it with a knife.
Well, you just rip the top off. They should just make a tear open tab.
Sometimes I'm hungry and I just chew at it.
Well, I know. I've seen the boxes.
Yeah, sorry.
It's gross.
I'll clean up later.
So what would a day look like for Cierra when you're in the lab? We know you're leaving the research lab for the medical lab, but what would a regular day look like for you? Are you just running
considering
tests?
all the COVID stuff too.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you two answers there. One of them with COVID has been essentially what a lot of people have been doing. It's just sitting in front of a desk for several hours at a time, working on the computer, which I do love the research, but I am definitely looking forward to things opening up where we can be more in person.
Yeah.
Before this, when I was able to go into the lab, I would kind of go in whenever I had time between classes. So it would be in the morning or the afternoon. I would show up, and a lot of the stuff was done on a computer too. So when you're doing literature review, that's where you are. If you need to look things up, if you need to find documents related to any devices that you're using in experiments, that's kind of what you're doing. But there's a lot of collaboration with other lab members too. So it is really helpful to be sitting next to the people you're working with, because you can always turn to them and ask them their opinion on one thing, or a lot of them have expertise that I don't necessarily have. So it was really helpful to have them close by. And then when we were getting ready for an experiment, you kind of have a few steps that you do. So you need to design you need the consent forms, you need to design the equipment list and a certain checklist of steps you need to go through. So you kind of go through setting that up. So you always have a camera recording during an experiment, of course, if that's something people have consented to. And then we tend to have somebody taking pictures too, just in case, because it helps to document where people are and how they're positioned during experiments, especially because when you're working with people who have an amputation, positioning during an experiment can have a really big effect on the results. So you need to make sure that you're documenting all of that. And then we would kind of run through the experiment. It would depend on which one we're doing. So if we're doing the work that I do, a lot of it was done in a computer environment too. So you'd have somebody sitting in a computer. They might be wearing a prosthesis or a simulated prosthesis. And then you make sure to have ask them if they need a break occasionally. And they would run anywhere between 1 to 3 hours. So you definitely want to give people the opportunity to have a break. And then after that, you kind of finish up the experiment, send them home, and then you kind of take everything down, put the equipment back, and then maybe I would work on the computer a little bit more just to make sure we get the data uploaded, and then home after that.
So what happens here if you have a client or a patient or a subject come in, whatever you call them, and they wear your latest prosthesis that people have been working on, and they totally bungle the KD, and you're like, this prosthesis is not working for this patient. Like, where do you go from there? Do you write a list of demands and go to your prosthesis engineer and say, you make these changes to this prosthesis?
Yeah.
Right? Or are you focused on the patient's experience, or what sort of data do you handle from all this?
Well, with this kind of experiment, I guess we are really focused on the comfort level of the participant or patient. So our main concern is making sure that they're able to function in their daily life. So if for some reason this prosthesis is not working for them, then that's something that we would want to fix. My lab we don't manufacture a lot of these devices, but when we do run experiments, a lot of the times we do have people with various kinds of devices, and we work along with now this is going to be a hard word, prosthetists. So these are ones that they help design the socket for the prosthesis and help fit them to the participant. So because we collaborate so closely with, it's called the Glen Rose Rehabilitation Hospital, and that's where we do, that's where a lot of the prosthetists work, and that's where people tend to go through the rehabilitation process. So we can communicate with them if there's something that's not working properly. That's kind of what we would do. If it's something that's really impacting their ability to do the experiment, a lot of the times we won't use their data because it might be something that's confounded by the device not operating properly. Sure. And then, of course, we can always communicate with the people who design these devices about something not functioning properly. If there's like a specific error that keeps happening, then that's something that we do. We would probably document and see if we could communicate with the companies that actually develop them.
Very cool. I guess my question is also, what kind of articulation do these prostheses have now?
It can vary. So this also depends on the level of amputation. So the closer you get towards the hand, then the more advanced you can get, because you have some more muscle targets that are still relatively intact. And then there's some commands that you don't need to worry about. So for example, if you have something that's closer to the wrist, you don't need to worry about the elbow activation. Whereas if it's somebody who's had an amputation around the shoulder, then you have to worry about a lot more controls. So the closer to the hand or the fingertip, the better these devices can, I guess, mimic human movement. And a lot of these prostheses, they have the capability to do almost the same things that human hands can do. So if you can like wiggle your fingers, you can open them up, you can make fists, you can do all these different positions. A lot of these devices have that ability. The issue is the communication between the human and the prosthesis. So if you only have a couple muscle targets you can activate or you can access, then that limits the amount of articulation you can give to the patient. So that's kind of the area of work that is kind of really active right now, is trying to find ways to help that connection between the device and the human.
Wow.
So Cierra, let's talk about little Cierra. How did you get into this research, I guess, first? Not too little. Perhaps you weren't thinking of this when you were 4. So let's just start with...
Well, maybe she was.
But maybe you were. We'll get that far back. So let's just talk, how did you pick this sort of area of expertise?
Well, like, I think I should be honest, like many students or many people who are entering into university, I did not really know what I wanted to do. So I just started with a normal science degree. I didn't even pick a major because I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. And then after my second year, I had to kind of pick a major. And so I was kind of forced into doing that. So when I switched universities at this time too. So I moved to the U of A. And then I was going through all the options for the majors, and there's so many choices. And then neuroscience looked really cool. So I was like, sure, I'll just pick that. I didn't have a lot of experience with neuroscience at the time. I had taken a few psychology courses, and that was probably the closest I got to it. So I just thought it was cool. It looked interesting, and I made the choice. And thankfully, that's the program that I got into. And it was really enjoyable. So
awesome.
I'm thankful that I did that. And then somewhere within that first year after I had transferred, so I think this was like third year, I knew that I needed to get some research experience, especially because it's kind of a research heavy degree. You kind of need to do some work in like the last year of your degree. So I started looking around, and thankfully I knew of this lab from before. So growing up, my dad, he was in the military. He was like a surgeon in the military. So he had worked on a lot of the patients. And so he collaborated a lot with this lab. So
oh, cool.
It's kind of interesting how these connections happen. And I guess having connections does really get you some of these opportunities. So I'm really thankful for that opportunity. but yeah, it's kind of unfortunate sometimes when it's just these connections that you have to that gave you that opportunity. But yeah, so I knew of this lab, and so I asked to just start volunteering there, and that's where I kind of started getting involved. I just started as a volunteer, and then I became more of a summer student, and then that's when I was able to do my undergrad thesis, and then also my master's. I was able to start there too. So kind of a little bit of a late start to knowing what I wanted to do, but I'm thankful that I kind of got into this area.
Yeah, that's really refreshing because there's so like myself too. When I was an undergrad, I picked sciences because I was raised to think that was what you did if you could. If you had the marks, that's where you just went, and rather than thinking about particular interests or career aspirations. And there's so many students. So I teach college biology, and there's so many students who have no idea what they want to do, and they think it's too late for them. Right? This is before university begins. They're like, I don't know what I want to do with my life. My life's over. You know, I don't have a future.
It's too late. I should know by now.
Right. So I think it's so refreshing to hear people be honest about their path.
Way. I didn't know what I was going to do until like the week before the application deadline. And I still didn't know. And I just stared at the application form. I was like, all right, I guess I'll pick science.
I was enrolled. Yeah, I was debating between philosophy and math, because I thought that sounded like a cool double major.
Did both, a philosophy and
math.
I
did neither. No, I did a minor in phosophy actually. And then I was thinking pharmacology toxicology is what I started enrolled in, but I switched out of that. Lickety split.
Pharmacology was hard. I took like one course in pharmacology, barely scraped through it, and then I was like, yeah, that's
I made the right call.
Amazing.
It sounds tricky.
But what did little Cierra want to be?
Yeah.
Like, what were you into as a little kid?
I didn't know. Like,
did you like have a collection of brains in jars? Or?
We'll call the police, perhaps, if that's true. There's something else going on.
Thankfully, no, I did not have a little brain collection at that age. When I was a kid, I was not decided either. I did have things that I was interested in. So I did ballet for a long time when I was young, and like other forms of dance too. And I liked it. I was interested in it, but I knew it probably wouldn't end up being a career for me. I just didn't want to make the decision yet on what I wanted to do. So all kids out there, if you're kind of debating whether you need to make up your mind, if you can make up your mind, that's great. But if you can't, then that's totally okay to want to kind of explore before you have to make
Absolutely.
The choice.
Yeah, I think young people get scared really early on that they have to make these big decisions so early, but it's the university system is built to allow you to sort of move fluidly through programs and schools. And
I would say the vast majority of people don't know what they're going to do.
And of the people who get an undergrad degree, how many end up picking a career where they use it?
I
that
don't.
Particular degree?
I don't.
I know, but that's most people I know. Like even people with PhDs, perhaps having a PhD got them to that career path, but they don't necessarily use what they learned from that field.
No.
So yeah, the world is pretty open if you have the privilege to go to post-secondary school. Absolutely. In any case.
And so now I want to ask about furniture restoration.
Yeah, we've been. Yeah. I mean, the science is great, but
that peaked. Med school, great, whatever. Furniture restoration. Hello.
How did that happen? So that's a new hobby you picked up?
Yes. So I am by no means an expert at it, so don't be asking me the details about how to do it, because I still have to Google things. And Pinterest has been great because it kind of shows you some neat ways of how to redo furniture. But yeah, it kind of started when it was a couple years ago, so it might have been a little bit before the pandemic hit. So I kind of had experimented a little bit with it before, but it's very busy, right? So I didn't really have a lot of time to actually get really into it. And a lot of the furniture I was using was just stuff that my parents wanted to give away. And I was like, no, I kind of want to try to work on this to make it look nice again. So that was my experience level. And then when the pandemic hit, I wanted to find more hobbies that I could do that didn't require me to be around other people and that I could do from home. So yeah, I kind of got into it. And one thing that's interesting too about the pandemic is a lot of people decided to get rid of older furniture. So nice. This is not a very expensive hobby.
Sweet.
Even though it might sound like it would be, because furniture can cost money. a lot of the stuff I got was essentially for free on the side of the road, and we kind of just pick it up and just experiment with it. Some stuff didn't work out too good, but some of it surprised me. It was actually pretty decent. So yeah, that's what I've been doing.
I, as a kid, was very into watching people restore furniture. It was like a big thing in the 90s on like TLC and whatnot, where people would not restore, but sort of
Like
do the
upgrade?
opposite. They would make it shabby chic, where they would like take this beautiful furniture that was intact and they would put some sort of chemical on it that would cause the paint to like crackle off and look really it's called like crackling or something, I think.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, is that what you do?
Are you from a 90s?
It's to make it look all chipped and
It's
ancient.
like pre-stressed jeans?
It's like doing that, but to
But
like
for your
beautiful
furniture.
wood. Yeah.
I haven't done that, so I'm not sure if that's something that only the experts know how to do. But I don't know how to make the.
You don't want to take nice looking furniture and make it look terrible. The 90s were weird.
So do you like repaint or reupholster? What kind of work do you do to the furniture you find? Or have you
I've done, like,
tried?
repainting or staining. I haven't done any reupholstering or anything yet. That is something that I think I want to learn how to do, but that's a whole new thing of its own. I've
Right.
seen videos of how people do it, especially the more intricate ones where they have so many of those little buttons in them. I don't know if I want to try it, just because I think I would definitely it would not be very pretty if I tried.
You're gonna need all these tools and
Yeah.
stuff.
You need a workshop.
Yeah.
Whole workshop.
So what's the future for Cierra? So you just got into medical school. Are you hoping to pursue some line of medicine that combines this research
Are you
experience?
hoping to get a bunch of brains in jars?
Still know about the brain.
Damn.
That's what I would do. I'm just saying, don't let me near.
He asks every guest this. I don't know what is up.
Who has them? Where can I find them?
So I think, I'm definitely wanting to see if I can combine some of the research experience I have so far with medicine. At this point, I don't know exactly what area I'd want to go into. I know some people are very decided right from the get-go, but at this point, there are so many options, so it's kind of hard to know at this point. But there's definitely a really good link between the work I was doing and rehabilitation and more of
Absolutely.
the clinical aspect. So ideally, I can combine medicine with research in the future, and keep up those connections with the lab I currently have with too. So that's the picture I have right now. We'll see if that changes, but yeah.
Well, yeah, the road's open to you. It's good to, I think it's always best to just keep an ear to the ground and like make note of the things that you're interested in and pursue those things, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's how I got into ecology. And first I was in pharmacology and I never would have pictured being into ecology. And just in my first year, I had one of the units was on that, and I found myself, that was what I was going back to and talking about with my friends and my family. And they're like, "You're really into this." And I hadn't even thought of it. I was like,
Why
"Oh,
won't you stop talking about
yeah,
this?
shut up already." Yeah. So yeah, I'm sure you'll find your thing.
Yeah, it's such a funny myth that people have to know what they're going to do in advance. It seems like it feels perpetuated by media that we consume, and yeah, I don't know. It doesn't feel helpful.
And it's daunting too, like when you're surrounded by people. Like I remember when I started my master's when I was working on amphibians, I didn't know anything about amphibians. I wasn't particularly interested in them. I liked the project, that's why I picked it. But there's someone else in my lab who, like, since he was a fetus, has been studying frogs.
A tadpole.
Yeah, just knew all the amphibians, and this was in Alberta. Like he was super into frogs, and I was like, I am not. And I felt like a fraud, but it doesn't.
A fraud or a frog?
Yeah. A frog. I missed that one. But it doesn't really matter, right? People find their path at all different stages.
And it changes over time. That's how the life of a scientist. You never know where you're gonna go.
Or any person.
Or any
right?
person. Yeah.
You gotta stay open to the universe, man. Well, this has been lovely, Cierra.
Thanks so much
Yeah,
for joining
yeah,
us.
thank you so much.
Yes, you're very busy. Best of luck. I know you don't need it, but best of luck with
Yeah.
your new path,
A great new adventure.
medicine, and hopefully COVID loosens up enough for you to be back in school.
Yeah. Being able
Thank
to
you so much.
get away. Oh, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Cierra. Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
That sounds super cool.
Had no idea that prosthetics are so advanced and detailed in that way.
It's crazy to think that even with a part of the body being missing, you can still, like, the brain can still try to communicate with it.
I
And
mean, that
could
pathway
still cause...
is open, right?
Yeah.
And now we just got to pick it
wild.
up. Yeah, it is. It's surprising. And it must be a big adjustment to, like, kind of retrain these things.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Well, she was mentioning the training system. Like, and it's interesting too that not everyone is going to necessarily want the newest technology, right? That's an assumption you make when that's not you, right? Because you only see the good stuff and not
the frustrating
the learning
parts,
curve and the fact that it might not really feel as part of you. And if this happens later in life too, I imagine, like you've gotten used to dealing with less. The idea of, getting this more complicated instrument isn't necessarily desirable. You've already figured out what to do with the other one.
I remember reading in some of the deaf community that people choose not to get cochlear implants because they like being part of that community. And they choose to, they don't see it as a deficiency. It's just part of who they are, and they don't need that prosthetic.
Absolutely. Well, that's a movement with neurodivergent people too, to not see that as being
something that needs to be remedied.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, man. It's the second time I said, hey, man.
Hey, man. Be open to the universe. Spirit of the 60s today.
Listen to people for what they want, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's truth.
That's the way to be.
That's the way to be. Hey.
Well, let's end on that note. Be
Hey,
open to
man.
the universe and just be the way you want to be.
I sound much more hippy dippy today than I really am.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Vinny. Thank you to Cierra for being our amazing guest. Thank you to our listeners.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us on another episode of
Learn Real Good. Send them out on our socials, Vinny.
If you want to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, follow us at LRG Pod. That's LRG Pod on all social media, or at least those three.
Yeah. The MySpace page is not up. I'll get on that. Our Bandcamp.
Yeah. Our Bandcamp for our audio.
Our ICQ.
All right, that's it for us today.
All right, see you folks. Bye.